All
This
right.
conference will now be recorded.
So, again, the presentation is called Backyard Stewardship, and I inserted the subtitle, Small Forests Are a Big Deal, because I really want you to understand that in a state like Vermont, even if the acreage of your parcel or your woodlot is small, it adds up to really meaningful things for ourselves, for our communities, for our wildlife, for our quality of life. So what is that word stewardship? So I use the word stewardship often to sort of replace the word management. So in a sort of traditional sense, management would be you'd be managing your forest or your land for a specific purpose. You'd be managing it for timber, you'd be managing it for wildlife. Stewardship implies sort of a long-term care responsibility, and also a holistic approach to taking care of the land. So you're not just targeting a specific resource, you're trying to just keep the land healthy, productive, vibrant, and functional. So one question, I sort of pulled these definitions of what a forest is off the internet. So one of the interesting things about these definitions is that all of them basically describe forests as a bunch of trees, right? So it's a place where there's trees. That must be what a forest is, right? Well, a modern understanding of forestry relies more on this idea of a natural community. So a natural community is not just the trees. It is actually an assemblage of different organisms. So organisms including trees, but also including other parts of a forested ecosystem. And also including, here, I'm just gonna, whoops. And also including the natural processes that affect them. So in this context, even the processes of natural disturbances, physical change, tree death, things like that are actually a really important part of forest ecosystems that we want to manage for, not just for the trees. And so I call this managing from a tree-based model, or moving from a tree-based model to a forest-based model. So instead of just saying, the forest is a bunch of trees and we're going to manage for there to be a bunch of healthy trees, we're thinking about, well, let's manage this entire system and understand that these forests are these really dynamic, interconnected systems that feature multiple parts, all of which are critical to their growth. And so we don't want to focus solely on one aspect. We want to manage for everything. So Vermont is unique in this way. Unique, I guess, from some other states, and also especially from states out west, in that we are primarily forested. We're about 76% forested. That's 4.4 million acres. And of that forested land, 80% of it is privately owned. So what that means is that all the forests that surround us, the forests that provide us with a beautiful place to live, the forests that provide us with clean air and clean water and wildlife habitat and carbon sequestration and storage, forest recreation, the vast majority of those are owned by private landowners who are making individual land management decisions based on their management philosophy and the best information that they have at hand. So it's this sort of decentralized system of managing this incredibly important public resource. And so the map on the left, you'll see all the brown areas are the parts of Vermont that are owned by private individuals. And the gray areas are everything else. So you might think of, oh, most of our forests are owned by the federal government, most of our forests are owned by the state, but actually it amounts to a pretty small fraction of Vermont's total forests. And of
Sorry,
that
but we're not seeing your screen anymore. Something happened.
Something happened. You're just seeing me?
I can see it.
I can see it.
I too can see it.
I cannot see it.
I can see it.
I can see it.
Weird. Well, let's try this.
I can see it.
Does that make any difference?
Yep,
Anybody?
I got it.
You got it now?
Yes.
Oh, thank goodness. Okay. Again, this is this will be a learning process for all of us. My understanding of this technology is still a little opaque, but we're doing the best we can. All right, so
There we go.
of Vermont's 88,000 parcels. Oh, I'm just gonna make sure everybody's muted here because I hear a little bit of chatter. Of Vermont's 88,000 parcels, 48,000 are less than 10 acres. So what that means is that, more than half of Vermont's parcel, now that's not accounting for half the land in Vermont, but more than half of Vermont's parcels are small in size. And so that adds up to a huge cumulative portion of our total forested land. And so I alluded to this earlier, but it's really important that we understand that one of the strange things about this model of having most of our forested land owned by private individuals is that we're relying on these forests to produce these massive public benefits. So forests are providing us with clean air, clean water, again, carbon sequestration and storage, wildlife habitat, flood attenuation, climate mitigation, and all these other things that are really, really important. And even just, a thing that I often mention is just the experience of living in Vermont, which is so beautiful. And part of that makes Vermont such an amazing place to live in is these forests. And so those forests are those benefits are ultimately public, but they're relying on people to do a good job managing their forests managing their privately owned forests in order to provide those benefits for everybody. And so your backyard is important, and it's important because these public benefits emanating from these private lands are stuff that benefit all of us. They benefit us whether you own a piece of land or not, whether it's 10 acres or whether it's thousands of acres in size. And so it's important that we have a good understanding of how we do this. Good management. All right, so I do another presentation that I call the Radical Forest Manager. The Radical Forest Manager is just an idea of, what makes a radical forest manager, what makes someone who's radically sort of engaging with our landscape and doing a good job of being a land steward. And what sort of applies to this context and is important for anybody who wants to manage or understand forested land is that you have to zoom out. So you have to place yourself in a broader context, whether that's ecologically, historically, socially. All these things influence the forests that we now have and are really important to your understanding of them and how to ultimately steward them. It's also really important that you're educated, open, informed, and humble, that you're willing to accept new information, and that you're willing to embrace nuance. So a lot of how we do a good job managing our land, a lot of that is really, really nuanced and requires you to sort of accept a greater depth of understanding about things that you might have already decided about, that many of us have already decided about, and instead to sort of accept the idea that it's more complicated than we originally thought it was. And you have to be willing to make tough decisions to do the right thing. So let's place ourselves in a little bit more historical context. So this is really important because this is what defines the forest that we have today. So if you were standing on almost any forest in Vermont 170 years ago, it would be a field. Vermont went from, prior to European settlement, being in excess of 95% forested to by the 1850s being somewhere from 20 to 40% forested. And so the places that were not cleared for forests were generally places that were very remote, high elevation forests, stuff like that. Almost every forest you've ever been in, with the exception of on the tops of some mountains, was probably a field at this time, and it was largely a sheep pasture. As you can imagine, the effects of this on our landscape were immense. And George Perkins Marsh, in his book, Man and Nature from 1850, he talks about widespread soil loss, extirpation of native species of wildlife, this sort of widespread ecological damage that ensued from this incredibly transforming time on our landscape. Many of our native wildlife were extirpated or driven to extinction at this time. And in our understanding of forests, again, moving from sort of a tree-based model to a system-based or a forest-based model, we understand that wildlife are a really important part of our forests, and that the effects of wildlife on our forests are measurable and are really serious. So what you're looking at, the picture you're looking at here, is the last catamount ever shot in Vermont in Barnard in 1881. Those catamount and timber wolves are two apex predators at that time, so were driven to extinction by predator bounties and then also by habitat loss. Also extirpated from the state were turkey and beaver and otter and black bear and marten, many white-tailed deer, caribou, elk, many different species of native wildlife. And what we learned about that, and what we've learned since in other parts of the country, is that these native wildlife often drive disturbances, which are really important for our forests as they grow and change. And many of these species that drive disturbances are actually keystone species. So they create changes in the forest that influence the type of wildlife habitat that's available to other species, or the different types of forests that are available. And so what you're looking at is a depiction of the passenger pigeon migrations that would gather in these mega flocks of billions of birds. And it was said that when they came through, John James Audubon, he said that when they came through a forest, it was like a tornado came through, and the guano was feet thick, and they would break off trees 2 feet in diameter and create this incredible disturbance, which is really, scary and bleak to think about. But also, disturbances are a really important part of forests and would have created some really interesting wildlife habitat across the landscape that now we have to emulate sort of with human-created disturbances. So those were driven to extinction. I think the last one was killed in the early 1900s. This is a species of elk called the eastern elk, also extinct, that was roaming Vermont's forests prior to European settlement. And the beaver is another species that we understand to be a keystone species. So by manufacturing wetlands, beavers create habitat for a number of different species, in addition to having some really interesting impacts on water quality. So improving water quality, lowering the effects of floodwaters and stuff like that. Some really interesting features. They were extirpated from the state, again, mostly for fur trapping, and also because they were seen as a nuisance. And then they were reintroduced in the early to mid 1900s. Interestingly, even prior to the 1700s, sort of early European exploration of our continent, by 1700, 250,000 beaver pelts had already been shipped to Europe. And so by the time most European settlers got here, they were massively sort of underestimating the amount of beaver that were actually on the landscape. We think that prior to 1700, in suitable habitat in our valleys, there was as many as 300 beaver dams per square mile. Square mile is 640 acres, so that's about a beaver dam every 2 acres, which is pretty amazing to think about, the effect of that and the habitat that they would have created. So in our forests, that history, has created some really interesting conditions. So basically, the forests that were cut to create those pastures in the early 1800s, the majority of them were what we now would call old growth forests. So old growth forests have a bunch of features, which I'm going to talk about in a second, but essentially our entire landscape was reset and sort of restarted. So, many of these pastures were maintained as pasture for 100 and 150 years, and only relatively recently were allowed to grow back into forests. And so you can grow old trees in 60 or 80 years, depending on the species, but to grow forests, which are these massively complex systems, they take hundreds or thousands of years to develop. And so our forests in general are younger, less diverse than old growth forests. They lack big trees, deadwood, and soil carbon compared to old growth forests. And our landscapes are also less diverse because all of our forests are about the same age. They haven't had a chance to develop all these sort of different stages of forest growth and different types of habitat that we know to have been present on our landscape prior to European settlement. The species are also different, and in general, what this adds up to is less healthy, resilient, productive forests overall. And so this is what everybody thinks that healthy forests look like. And if this looks really good to you, don't be ashamed, because this is what most people think looks really good. And this is what a lot of people would associate with old growth forests as well. These sort of massive trees, they're all about the same age, they're all widely spaced, there's nothing growing in the understory. It looks clean, it looks tidy and well managed. Everybody looks at this and they're like, wow, this looks really great. Unfortunately, that's not what healthy forests actually look like. This is what healthy forests actually look like. They are what many people would call messy, I would call them complex, irregular, diverse. What we know about from our remnant old growth forests is that what forests do over time is develop many different sizes and ages and species of trees. There's a ton of dead wood that's on the ground, dead standing trees, trees of all different species, structural diversity, so that's trees of different canopy heights, and then also horizontal diversity, which is different patches of trees of different sizes and ages. So it's this incredibly diverse dynamic ecosystem of which the death of trees is a really, really important part. That's how we get soil, that's how we get new generations of trees, and that's how we get this diversity, which we now understand to be really critical to how forests maintain themselves over time. So diversity is not just sort of important in principle, it also helps forests be more resilient to disturbances. So if you can think about, we know that monocultures in any context are unstable. So if you have all trees that are all the same size or all the same age or all the same species, they're going to have a lot less tools in their toolkits to respond to the different complex disturbances that come up as our climate changes, and just in general respond to natural disturbances. And so, as weird as it may seem, when I manage forests, I'm actually trying to manage forests that looks more like this than that. Messy is good, that's what I say. Messy is not always good, but just because it's messy doesn't mean that it's bad. And healthy forests often look really messy. And so, getting into how we manage for really healthy, diverse forests, it's important for you as a landowner or as someone who's just interested in the land to know your land. This is a great Aldo Leopold quote. I love Aldo Leopold. He says, "We can be ethical only in relation to something we can see, feel, understand, love, or otherwise have faith in." And so what he talks about when he's talking about being ethical, he's talking about doing the right thing, treating your land right, not sacrificing the long-term health and viability of the system for sort of short-term gain, especially as far as forests that have been approached with an extractive mindset for a really long period of time. And so my favorite forestry professor in forestry school, John Shane, would say, you need to go out and look at stuff. He would say, just go walk around and just look at stuff in the woods, and that's how you learn about how they work. And so I'm going to walk through some of the ways that you guys can know your land a little better. Identifying trees is really, really important because there's a lot of great resources out there, but we in Vermont, we're not growing a single species of trees or a couple species of trees in most cases. We're trying to grow a diverse array of up to like 50 native species of trees. And so what that means is that each one of these trees behaves differently, has different attributes, means different things about the site where it's growing, tells you different things about history, and you can't interact with any of those resources if you can't identify trees. Identifying trees can be pretty hard. It can be one of those things where it's much easier to go out with someone who already knows than it is to sort of learn from a book, because a book will usually give you actually too much information and you'll have too many options and you'll get stuck. But this is a book that I really like. It's called A Beginner's Guide to Recognizing Trees in the Northeast by Mark Mikolas. And his idea is that instead of identifying trees, you recognize them. And he sort of talked to some of his friends who grew up knowing how to tell which tree was which just by recognizing them, and to drill down on those charismatic features, not to give you too much information, to give you just enough to identify the tree species. I also like the book Bark by Michael Wotek. And there's also classes. I'm doing on Thursday, I'm doing another webinar on tree identification, and then a week from Thursday as well. I'll be doing one in partnership with Vermont Coverts and Vermont Woodlands Association. These are, if you guys haven't read these books, they're really amazing. Both are written by Tom Wessels. Tom Wessels is from the southern part of the state. I don't know if he lives in Vermont and New Hampshire now, but I grew up with him being around in Windham County, and he's an amazing resource. If you ever had a chance to take a walk with him, please do. But his book, Reading the Forested Landscape, I pull this thing out all the time, and I get something new out of it every single time. The idea is looking at your forest and understanding the land use history of your forest from basically reading like signs. His other book is called Forest Forensics, so it's sort of like the forensics of how we tell how land was managed in the past and what that means for the forest that we now have. And understanding that our forests largely are reflective of past human land use, it can be really interesting. And also just interesting to see, knowing that this was a plowed field versus this was a pasture, etc. And so another thing to look at and to understand is that, again, our landscape is made up of many smaller parcels and many different pieces, but they function as a whole. Wildlife don't know that they're different pieces. And so it's important that we understand how my property, or how a property connects to the broader landscape. How does it provide habitat conditions which are the same or different from adjacent properties and adjacent parts of the landscape, connected parts of the landscape? Are there any natural communities, habitat types of significance? Are there any rare, threatened, endangered species? And fortunately, in Vermont, we have two really amazing streaming map services that are completely free and really easy to use. One is called BioFinder. One is called the Agency of Natural Resources, the ANR Atlas. Both of those have a ton of different information. BioFinder has a lot of information about if your property is part of a larger habitat block, and how it connects to the broader landscape, if there's wildlife crossings that are used, if it's connecting other blocks. And the Agency of Natural Resources has all kinds of different stuff, from wetlands and rare, threatened, endangered species, all that kinds of stuff. And so if you haven't, and you can also just physically look at your property, an aerial photo of it, and just sort of see how it relates to the surrounding properties. Connectivity, excuse me a second. Connectivity is really important. So forests are functional as big chunks, and the bigger they are, sort of the more functional they are, for a bunch of different reasons. One of those reasons is that, again, recognizing that wildlife are an important part of the forest that we're managing. Wildlife need to move between different kinds of habitat on the landscape. They need to move from sometimes lowland sites to upland sites, or just between forests of different ages or different species at different times of the year for different needs, for reproduction or shelter or for foraging at different times of the year. And many different species, there are some species which are perfectly comfortable moving across a road or an agricultural field or a house site or something like that, but many of them are not. And so when we want to provide our wildlife with really good opportunities to survive and thrive on our landscape, and so we need to also provide them the means to move across our landscape. What hampers their movement is roads, development, agriculture, anything that basically splits up a forest into smaller pieces, or cuts one piece of forest off from another, could be called fragmentation, which we'll talk about a little bit more. The other thing that happens is, as forested blocks get smaller, they become less suitable habitat for different species. So a species like bear, moose, bobcat need large ranges. And so as our landscape becomes more fragmented and the connected little blocks of habitat become smaller, it may no longer be suitable habitat for certain species. So there's also some stuff called edge effects. So edge effects are what happens around the edge of these blocks. So in thinking about sort of a landscape of Vermont from 300 years ago, mostly our forest was in these big blocks, and there was sort of some edges between forests and wetlands, or forests and rivers and stuff like that. But for the most part, it was pretty big chunks of forest. Now we have this sort of a mosaic of many different pieces, all of which have really substantial edges between them. And what an edge is just the area where that forest meets a non-forested area. Those edges can cause all kinds of strange stuff to happen. So ecologically, there are edge effects that are measurable into the forest for about 300 feet. That's a huge area of forest. Also, they are vectors for stuff like increased nest predation. So nest predators tend to be more abundant near those edges. And then also invasive exotic species tend to be have an easier time invading closer to those edges. So as our forest basically gets split up into smaller and smaller chunks that may be disconnected from each other, it just in general becomes less functional. And so there's two words that we use that you may have heard. One's called fragmentations, one's called parcelization. Fragmentation is when these forested blocks are split up into smaller physical chunks by agriculture, by land clearing of any kind, development, the installation of roads. Any one of those things fragments the landscape. Parcelization is where our landscape is split up into smaller and smaller parcels. And this is primarily a problem. Well, it's a problem for a few different reasons, but those parcels often also lead to development and fragmentation. So that was just sort of a real quick and dirty and about knowing what you have on your land. And what I want to stress is that there's a lot of partners that you can rely on who can tell you more about how to manage your land, and they can give you sort of individualized ideas of how to do this. And even if you're not a landowner, so there's a county forester for every county. If you live in Vermont, there's a county forester that you're in the area of. And our job is to go out and to advise private landowners on how to manage their land. And I go out on people's land that are a few acres. I go out on people's land that are thousands of acres. And it's just sort of my job to talk to you about how to manage your land, your forested land, to be really, really healthy. There are also a number of partners that I work very closely with: Vermont Coverts, Vermont Woodlands Association, Audubon Vermont, Vermont Land Trust, Vermont Fish and Wildlife, Vermont Urban and Community Forestry, Cold Hollow Canada, and there's a number of local conservation organizations, local conservation commissions, town forest committees. All of these organizations are putting on programming all the time to try and help you have a better understanding of how to manage your forested land. So if you're on social media, follow them on social media, and they'll be putting out all these different stuff that, it's just sort of our challenge to get people to come to them, and sometimes is harder than it should be. Or you'll get on an email list, or you can become a member of Vermont Woodlands Association, or take Vermont Covert's annual weekend-long training, and get connected with those organizations, because they will provide you with a lot of different opportunities to learn more. And that's a lot of what I do for people, is I call it like the triage. So I'll go out on your property and I'll say, okay, you don't need to know about how to do everything. This is what you're interested in, and this is the situation on your property. And so maybe there's one or two different things that you should really, really focus on. So here's how we do something about our forest. So this is my plug for sort of the type of forest management that I do. This might not be appropriate for your property if it's a smaller property, but I just really think that there is a way for humans to interact with our forests in a way that is positive, and that is regenerative, that is symbiotic and altruistic, that our influence can actually be wholly positive. And that's hard for a lot of people to conceptualize, because in many cases, our track record is so bad, but it doesn't mean that we can't do it. And I think that there's a lot of room for us to help be a partner with our forest in creating a functional, vibrant landscape that works for us and also works for the forest itself and the wildlife that occupies it. And so I do a type of management called ecological forest management, and this is using logging in a way that's really, really amazing. And so what we do is, instead of having this sort of wholly extractive approach, we manage forests like they manage themselves. So we're managing like those old growth forests. We're managing for many different ages and sizes of trees, many different species of trees. We're leaving a lot of big trees that we call biological legacy trees, because we understand that big trees serve all these really important ecological functions. And we're using logging to basically drive that disturbance and make our forests more diverse and more like those old growth forests. We're also creating small pockets of early successional habitat, young forest, and other conditions which might be underrepresented across the landscape, again, because of land use, human land use. We're also taking a lot of care to protect sensitive and unusual features, and I'm spending a lot of time trying to recruit dead wood, just putting dead wood on the forest floor and making sure there's plenty of dead standing trees, because we also understand that these, which were once thought to be a nuisance, actually serve a really important function in the forest. So here's some stuff you can do focused on wildlife. What you'll see with a lot of this stuff is that the right thing to do is sort of often right for everything. And so you'll see sort of again and again, I sort of talk about the same things. Maybe you can play the game at home or see how many times I say the word diversity. But diversity is really good for everything. And here's some ways specifically, things you can do to improve diversity in your forest and also create some features that are specifically targeted at improving habitat for wildlife. So this is what we call, this is a diagram of what we call a bird-friendly forest. It features many of the things that I've talked about forests having in general. So it has big trees, it has a variety of trees of different sizes and ages and species, dead standing trees, dead wood on the forest floor, different habitats of different types, all different kinds of areas for all different kinds of birds. And so this is really a neat way to sort of think about your forest and try to a condition to try to manage your forest for, because that's just how forests manage themselves. This is what old growth forests look like. And why wouldn't we want to manage forests like they manage themselves? But also because in doing all these things and providing this complex vertical structure and pockets of softwood and pockets of hardwood and big trees and wetlands, all these other things, and protecting all these sensitive features, we're also providing really good habitat for a variety of different species, including birds. And so if you're interested, the Audubon Vermont developed this really cool shorthand for understanding the different types of bird habitat that are in your forest called the Birder's Dozen. So this is 12 bird species that all have slightly different habitat requirements. They're also, for the most part, pretty easy ones to identify and hear. And coming up, you're going to hear a lot of these guys returning. They're all in southern parts south of us now, but they'll be returning to our state soon. And their presence means that there are different kinds of habitat. So like black-throated blue warbler needs to nest in low brush, in sort of a understory brush layer. And so if you don't have that, you're not going to have black-throated blue warbler mating in your forest. Scarlet tanager needs a more overstory intact canopy. So if you don't have that, you're not going to have scarlet tanager in your forest. So if you see all 12 of these species, it probably means that you have a pretty good range of different types of habitat for these birds. There are some other individual attributes and features that I want to break out. If you hang out with foresters enough, you'll probably hear us talk about snags and cavity trees. What a snag is a dead standing tree. It used to be considered sort of a nuisance, and a lot of old timers would go out of their way to sort of cut down every piece of dead standing trees. But we now understand dead standing trees to have remarkable wildlife value. Additionally, cavity trees, which snags can also be cavity trees, those are just trees that have a hole in them. And so what you'll see with snags or trees that are declining is that often their habitat for fungi and invertebrates, insects, and woodpeckers, in their search for those insects, will excavate cavities in the tree. Those cavities will become places where all different kinds of birds, mammals like flying squirrel and fisher, and you see there's a little bear in that picture, all the owls, all different kinds of things will use those cavities in dead and living trees. We call them wildlife hotels. And the trees themselves, as they die and break down, they're also really important habitat for, again, smaller stuff like bugs, amphibians, bats. They're also representing carbon storage. They're also representing future soils as they degrade into the organic layer of the soil. Dead wood. So one of the interesting things that, I walk on a lot of people's land and they talk about how they cut their firewood from trees that fall over all the time. And my attitude about it is I think that if a tree's on the ground, you should leave it there because it's providing all this amazing habitat. It's improving the health of your soil. So it's enriching your soil with organic material and carbon. It's providing hydrologic benefits, protecting your forest floor from erosion and soaking up excess surface water. It's providing soil carbon, so helping our forests sequester and store more carbon. And it's also providing habitat for invertebrates, insects, salamanders, small animals, frogs, snakes, all kinds of stuff. Ruffed grouse will drum on them in their mating display. You can see that in the picture on the bottom of the screen. Dead wood is great. And so what I would usually say is leave the dead wood on the ground. And then if you're interested in cutting firewood, there is work that you can do to cut living trees in order to release trees you really want to grow from competition. So helping your healthiest trees grow even faster and be even less stressed out by cutting the trees that are competing with them, rather than cutting trees that are already on the ground and providing all these wildlife benefits. You'll also probably, if you spend enough time with foresters, hear us talk about mast trees. So mast is basically a seed of a species that is eaten by wildlife. And so common species of mast is, you can see that bear clawing up a beech tree. So beech produce beech nuts. Oaks produce acorns. Those are what's called hard mast, and bitternut and shagbark hickories in Vermont also produce hickory nuts. And then there's a whole lot of species of soft mast, cherries, black choke and pin cherries, serviceberries, other stuff like that. Many of our native species of viburnum. And they're valued by all kinds of different stuff, and they're actually can be, especially those that mature in fall and late summer, as many of them do, can be this really critical source of food for wildlife like bears that are about to go in hibernation, or deer which have to overwinter, you know, and squeak by all winter just trying to stay alive. And for our migratory songbirds as they're bulking up, trying to make a huge migration as they do every year. So one thing you can do to help crop trees, and I actually do this in my forest with, you can do it specifically with trees that produce mast, like oak trees, or you can just do it with any tree that's healthy. And so what you do is, it's called a crop tree release or a mast tree release. And basically all it is that you're taking a tree that you want to grow, which is hopefully a healthy, really vigorously growing tree, and you're releasing it from competition by cutting a tree next to it. So all you do is you walk up to your tree, that's your crop tree, the tree you want to grow, and you look at the other trees whose crowns are touching the crowns of that crop tree, and cut, let's say, release it from competition on 2 to 3 sides. Depending on the species, the standards are a little bit different, but usually, you know, 2 sides is enough for many species. And all that's going to do is basically alleviate the stress of that tree that you want to grow, of competing with its neighbors, and it can spend more energy defending itself and producing more mast for wildlife, expanding its crown, and just being more healthy in general. And that's where you can get your firewood. But I often do that. When I do that, I often will put a lot of those trees on the ground, just dump them on the ground, understanding again that wood on the ground is not something that we have enough of, and that it has all these amazing ecosystem benefits. Or I'll girdle trees that are competing with the crop trees. Girdling is just where you cut around the circumference of the tree just a notch, or not a notch, but a groove about 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep, all the way around the circumference, and it severs the cambium of the tree and kills it, but retains it structurally as a snag. And so you've created a snag, but you've alleviated the tree that you're trying to grow, your crop tree, from competition. And I would say when you do this, don't create a monoculture, don't create an orchard, don't make it look nice, don't cut trees that aren't competing with the crop tree, even if there's some obvious wound or defect on them. Be really strict with yourself. And doing this way, you can really prioritize your time and make the most of the time that you're spending in the woods to release as many crop trees and help your forest be as healthy as possible. If you're going to do that, I really recommend you take a chainsaw safety course. There's this really amazing system called Game of Logging. If you use a chainsaw, or if you don't use a chainsaw because you're not comfortable, this is the way to cut a tree confidently. So it goes exactly where you want it to. It's safe. It's really, really a good system. Primarily administered by Northeast Woodland Training. These are courses that will teach you how to fell a tree confidently. And so please, please, please make sure you're confident before you start tipping trees over. So it's also important to understand that, you know, across our landscape, so, you know, I talk about things we want everywhere, right? Like we want structural diversity. We want trees of many different sizes and ages everywhere, and dead standing trees everywhere. But there are also special habitats. There are habitats critical habitats that have landscape-wide importance, that if you have one, it's worth protecting. One of those is a deer wintering area. So I'll talk about a little bit about the other side of deer later. But we know that deer population is limited by the amount of wintering areas they have access to. A deer wintering area is an area usually softwood species, so hemlock, sometimes spruce, that have a really tight, intact canopy. And in there, the snow depths are much lower. It's a little bit warmer, and so deer will spend a lot of time there in the winter. and it will alleviate them from some of the stresses of being a deer in the winter. Other habitats are vernal pools. That's an area that's seasonally inundated with water in the spring, and it's really important habitat for breeding amphibians. Wetlands, and then also young forests. So what I was alluding to it a little bit earlier, areas of what we call early successional habitat, areas of big openings, big blowdowns, stuff like that, is also really, really critical in our landscape. And we actually don't have enough of it, again, because our landscape is pretty young and hasn't had a chance to develop this sort of patchy, mosaic-like appearance that it likely had prior to European settlement. So here are some threats. So, in many cases, there are opportunities in our forest, and a given forest, there might be some opportunities to improve some things, maybe to release some mass trees or to create some more structural diversity, put some dead wood on the ground, improve some different attributes. But I think that from a minimum responsible stewardship perspective, we should be dealing with, or helping our forest deal with, some of the threats that are posed, many of which are caused by people. And so this is a spotted knapweed. This is a really virulent invasive plant, really pretty flower, but really, really challenging invasive plants for primarily open field areas. Invasive plants, invasive exotic plants, I sometimes just call them invasives, are a really, really big deal. And so, I've sort of talked about the way that forests are dynamic and how death is a really important part of life in the forest. And this process of trees dying and natural forest regeneration occurring, creating diversity and creating different types of wildlife habitat, new generations of trees, is incredibly critical. And these invasive plants are a threat to that directly because they threaten a forest's ability to regenerate. What you're seeing is a picture of an infestation of Japanese barberry. Other common invasives are common buckthorn, multiflora rose, shrub honeysuckle, the list goes on. These are all species that we have introduced intentionally at some point in time, either, for the example of multiflora rose was a living fence, same thing with common buckthorn. Honeysuckle was an ornamental plant, as was Japanese barberry, as is Japanese barberry. And these plants are, in a novel landscape, they don't have their natural checks and balances that occur in their natural landscape where they're from. And so they are just able to take over. And so, I say the word diversity a lot, but anything that threatens a forest's diversity and its ability to regenerate over time is an existential threat to the health of forests. And so this is what invasive exotic plants do. Not only do they produce worse wildlife habitat than native plants, they inhibit our ability to grow new generations of trees by outcompeting them left and right, but they also are a threat to their diversity on a landscape scale. I have a note here, control versus eradication. We will never eradicate them from our landscape completely. I think a reasonable objective for landowners is to think about establishing what I would call control. Control is a level of infestation by these species where you don't need to use herbicide or anything like that. You can go through and pull individual invasive plants out as they established when they're little. That would be a really, really good level of control. And I would say that the minimum level of responsible management of a forest, even if you say, I want to be completely hands-off, I want to just let my forest do its thing, no management plus invasive species management, in my mind, is the minimum responsible level of management, because this is a problem that we've created, and our forests cannot be natural, vibrant, diverse forests without these being addressed proactively. They'll never get better on their own, they only get worse. And not doing anything is also not just a problem for you, because many of these species are spreading across boundary lines. The seeds are being eaten by birds and they're being pooped on other people's properties, and it's a landscape level problem. And so not managing them and continuing to allow the invasives on your property to produce seeds is kind of like pollution. And people who are actually trying to deal with the problem are continuing to receive, seeds from other properties that are not dealing with it. And why not deal with it before it becomes a problem? So learn how to identify these species. There's a really great website called btinvasives.org, and that will provide you with fact sheets for many of our common invasive plants. and deal with them now. If you have one plant, you have a problem and it's going to get worse. And so deal with it now. And if you have the larger your infestation is, the less options you'll have and how to take care of it. And so pragmatically, there's sort of, well, there's really 3 different methods of control, but 2 main methods. The first one is called mechanical control. So this is your hand pulling plants, your pulling them out with something called a weed wrench, which is a mechanical tool that sort of gives you more leverage to pull out bigger plants, or you're yarding them out with a tractor. You're girdling them. Remember I talked about girdling larger trees. So you're just severing that outer area of bark around the circumference of the tree. Maybe you're cutting them. These methods, all these invasive plants are really, really good at staying alive. And so using these methods, especially if you're using cutting, but pulling as well, it will require repeated visits. You'll have to come back again and again and again to pull out the same plants over and over and over again. So if it's a couple of plants and you can just, run your lawnmower over it when you're mowing your lawn, no big deal. You just, every time you mow your lawn, you can cut it. If you have acres and acres and acres of dense buckthorn, honeysuckle, barberry, you need to be realistic about the amount of time that you can actually invest in this. And so the important thing is that you deal with the problem, and maybe you're one of these people who's just really, really intense and can be out there every weekend pulling, cutting, dealing with the problem. My experience with mechanical control is that with larger infestations, mechanical control usually doesn't work. And it's not because it can't work, it's because people aren't investing the amount of time and energy. They can't invest that amount of time and energy to actually deal with the problem on a meaningful scale. And so this is the thing, this is like everybody's taken aback when I talk about this part always. Chemical control. So chemical control is controlling the plants using herbicide. I've gone from being an herbicide skeptic personally and being someone who eats organic food and really being skeptical of herbicide as a chemical altogether, to understanding that to address invasive plants on our landscape, it will involve the use of herbicide. And what's amazing about herbicide is when you treat plants with herbicide, they will die and you don't have to go back to them again and again. It's much less intense on your body. It requires much less time. And you will be more effective because it doesn't require you to, maintain the sort of intensity and intention that's required to kill these species. It doesn't mean that we're misblowing our entire forest with herbicide. What it often means is doing like really surgical, really targeted, minimal herbicide usage. I use this tool called the buckthorn blaster in many cases, which is on the screen here. Basically, you just cut the stem of an invasive plant. That's a 4-ounce modified bingo dauber, and you put diluted herbicide concentrate in it and dab it on the cut surface of the stump, and that's it. And you can kill a big buckthorn with like a couple drops of herbicide. We're talking about like maybe a couple ounces of herbicide per acre or less. There are some cases when people will also use a foliar spray. That's the other picture that's there. I've done that before, and I use a little hand pump backpack sprayer, and you can like spray around little oaks and be really, really surgical. It's not like you're just sort of carpeting the land with herbicide. It's a really interesting thing where it's what I've realized now is that what is far more radical than categorically rejecting herbicide is understanding that what's really, really important is that we have these healthy functional ecosystems, which in addition to, I think, deserving to exist free of interference from invasive exotic plants, they need our assistance in order to address this problem. And so using herbicide in that context to help them be diverse, vibrant, long-term healthy forests, in that context, using herbicide I think is far more radical than just sort of rejecting it. And I'd be happy to continue this conversation over email or in the questions section after this as well. So what you can do instead is, instead of continuing to plant non-native species, as we all have done and caused all these problems, plant native plants. There's all these amazing native plants a lot of people like Audubon and the NRCS know a lot more about especially herbaceous plants than I do, and pollinators and stuff like that. But you can plant for blooms and fruit during all seasons, and to create this really diverse, vibrant landscape. There's an opportunity to make your backyard this incredibly abundant source of good things rather than, just the seeds of invasive species. And you can do so in a way that promotes structure, diversity, and all those sort of same attributes that we're looking for across our landscape and in our forests. We also want to recognize that pollinators are really important. So a lot of you might have small areas of open land, and also recognizing that pollinators are keystone species in most terrestrial ecosystems. They account for the reproduction of 85% of the Earth's flowering plants, and their seeds and their fruit are part of the diet of like 25% of birds and mammals on our landscape. And so pollinators are really, really important. In some cases, it may be as simple as moving from a lawn to a less maintained structure while watching out for invasive exotic invaders. But in some cases, you could also plant native flowering shrubs and also native herbaceous annual and perennial species. There's a really amazing place called the Xerces Society that you'll see there. That has a lot of good resources about pollinators, and another resource is the NRCS as well, which has funding for some of these on private land. This is just a cool graph that I like to show. This is the number of species in Vermont of all the different types without invertebrates. This is the number of species with invertebrates. So these invertebrates are keystone species because they're pollinators. They're providing all these sort of background ecosystem services that make our ecosystems work. And they're also the base of the food chain that's supporting all of our, many of our neotropical songbirds and other mammals, fish, amphibians, reptiles, all those things. So another threat, deer browse. So we've now recognized in many parts of the state we have an overpopulation of deer. If you're from a southern state, if you're from Massachusetts or southern parts of New York or New Jersey or Pennsylvania, any of these other places, you know that this is a huge issue. And so what happens is that deer will browse, eat small trees, the twigs and the buds, especially in the wintertime. And they eat certain species. They don't eat other species. They don't eat invasive exotic plants nearly as much as native species that we like ash and sugar maple and red oak, yellow birch. And so when there's too many deer in the landscape, you can have regeneration failure. So it's really hard to have natural regeneration of native species, of trees and plants. And in some of these really, really intensely deer impacted landscapes, species like orchids are completely absent from the landscape. And you can also have just a understory regeneration that is just much less diverse. So you'll get basically only tree species that deer don't like to eat, like beech, like invasive exotic plants, stuff like that. And so this is an increasing problem, and this is something where it's not that bad in most areas yet. And so we actually have an opportunity to do something about it. We can address this proactively instead of waiting, sort of until it's like Long Island and we have 100 deer per square mile and we can't grow any food in our gardens and we have hundreds of deer car collisions in every town every year and massive tick-borne disease problems and all these other things. In addition to forests which lack diversity and are generally unhealthy as a result of deer browse. So here are the solutions. You can hunt deer. You can especially hunt antlerless deer because that's how you lower the population. Shooting bucks does not do nearly as much to lower the population as antlerless deer, does. If you don't want to do that, you can let others hunt your land. You can certainly do not post your land. And if you're uncomfortable with your land being completely open to hunters, you can post your land hunting by permission only. So put your address up, give people the opportunity to give you a call, and you can have people that you trust and that you know are supposed to be on your land rather than just anyone whose responsibility it is to help you manage your deer population and protect your forest. And so that's really, really an important step. And I should say, just from earlier in the slide, so deer overpopulations, they're caused by a number of different things, caused by increase in posted land, decreasing hunter numbers. We have about half the hunters that we had in the 1970s, and we're expected to have half the amount we have now in 10 years. And so we may need to also sort of re-engage different non-traditional constituencies of people to help us with this hunting problem. Also increase urban and suburban areas. Deer aren't sensitive to that in the same way as other species. And we also did kill all their major predators. Couple more slides here. I recognize that we're at 8 o'clock. I'll wrap it up in just a couple of minutes. So development is the thing that really keeps me up at night. Vermont's total forest cover is decreasing by about 2,000 acres a year. Our rate of development is twice as fast as our population, so we're not developing efficiently. And our average parcel size is decreasing while our number of landowners increases, which just means that we have an increasingly parcelized and fragmented landscape. And so the reason that this is the thing that really keeps me up at night is that more than, bad logging or something like that, development is permanent. And when you develop a piece of land and pave over it or put a house there, that will never sequester carbon. It'll never provide wildlife habitat. It'll never provide many of these services that we understand forests to be so important for again. And so that's really, really, really important, is that we understand the threat that development can be. And so what can we do? Because we also understand that we don't want to create a situation where just no one can live here. We want to form a more functional ethic around development. And so how do we do that? One way is by advocating for more dense development around areas that are already fragmented. So those are our village centers, our city centers, and advocate for less development in rural areas and in interior forest blocks. So we can develop the areas that are already developed, and we don't have to chop up our remaining chunks of forested land into smaller and smaller pieces. Creating other standards like limiting long driveways. So long driveways, you can, instead of putting your house close to the road, which is already a fragmenting feature, people punch, a big long driveway hundreds of feet up into the woods and impact that entire area. And eventually a forested block starts to look like Swiss cheese. Ridgetop development, same thing. Development in important recognized wildlife corridors ideally would not be happening. And you can have a voice in this by joining your local planning commission and conservation commission town committees. They're always looking for members and volunteers, and you can have a huge impact on the way that your town is developed by doing that. Also, working with land trusts, we need to conserve as much land permanently as we can. And so working with land trusts to advocate for that is also really, really important. So the Vermont Land Trust, you might have a local land trust as well. Finally, climate change is obviously a huge threat, existential threat to our forests and many different parts of them, sort of exacerbating all of the other threats that we've talked about thus far. And we can managing forests in the way that we've described, so managing them for structural diversity and have lots of dead wood and have big trees still in the forest, and protect sensitive features like wetlands. All of those are features that will also increase the ability of forests to sequester and store carbon. So their ability to suck up the carbon that we're producing and mitigate climate change. At the same time, climate change is gonna really stress them out. So we're expecting climatic changes, and we're expecting greater abundance of invasive exotic species and a more fragmented landscape and more deer and all of these other things, and new invasive pests and stuff like emerald ash borer. And so what we really need to do is manage forests to increase their health and also their diversity and also their resilience. So managing forests that are holistically healthy will give them more tools to respond to whatever forms the stressors and challenges that come up that are associated with climate change. And again, protecting and encouraging biodiversity, both for its own sake, because it's really important, and because we understand that it's an important part of healthy forests as well. So I can send you, if you email me at ethan.tapper@vermont.gov, which is in the chat area, I can send you a PDF of this plan, or of this presentation rather. And these are just some other names of other resources that you can have access to that can help you be a good forest landowner. If you have a smaller piece of land, the Backyard Woods program, which is run by Vermont's Urban Community Forestry Program, is a really cool program for helping you become more educated about that. The Coverts, Vermont Coverts also does a weekend-long training program that's really, really special if you want to learn more about managing forests and wildlife. With that, that is it, gang. So I'm going to see if I can stop sharing my screen and answer some of your questions that come up. I see that basically John McNerney has taken care of all the questions. Thank you, John. Let's see here. You can feel free to.
I was trying to keep up.
Thank you. I appreciate
Mostly
it.
just providing web links and stuff.
Yep. So anyone else? So if you have your video, you can raise your hand, or if you have a question, type it in the chat box. Okay. So I see someone one thing I did see earlier is someone asked about the book The Overstory by Robert Powers, I believe. And my thoughts on that. It's a really interesting book. So it's really, really good. I'd recommend you all read it. It's about trees. It's about many other things. It's fiction. But there's especially a character in it who has a really developed understanding of how forests work and understanding and articulating the role that like death and disturbance has in forests and how that's actually sort of an enriching factor of forests and not something that is compromising its health. That's really important. And one of my friends said, you know, he said it's an anti-logging book. It's about the redwoods and logging in the redwoods. And I would argue that it's not actually an anti-logging book. It's just about not logging like 2,000-year-old trees, right? So we can't continue to apply this monolithic idea that every single square foot of our land exists solely for our benefit and, you know, to use to extract timber from. You know, maybe there are really special features like vernal pools, like wetlands, like unique areas and rare, threatened, endangered species that deserve additional protections. So I would say it's arguing for sort of a more nuanced approach to forest management. Let's see here. So from Catherine, what do you suggest remediating soil compaction? More of an issue in urban forests? I guess, so I would recommend, you know, for more urban forests, I call them town trees that are in these more urban areas. That's really more of the purview of an arborist, or I would see what the resources are from the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry, UCF program. They have a lot of amazing resources for arborists and for town tree wardens and people like that. I would say that one thing that in forestry, what we're trying to do all the time is to develop soils. And so we understand that prior to European settlement, we had these incredibly rich, robust, deep soils that were really rich in forest carbon and organic material. But that since, you know, they were cleared, you know, and in many cases, very steep land, very marginal farmland was cleared. We know we lost a lot of soil, and probably the farmers the first generation of farmers on that land thought they were really good farmers, right? Because they had amazing soil that had never been farmed in that way before. But they were actually just responding to thousands of years of bioaccumulation of amazing stuff. And so now what we're trying to do is we're understanding the role that soils have in our forests. When we're logging, we really want to be careful about impacting soils, so not causing soil compaction, not causing erosion, not causing root damage and ruts and stuff like that. We understand the soil now to be this incredible medium through which trees are connected to each other, and they're behaving altruistically as a community. They're especially connected by these underground fungal networks, which are allowing them to sort of share resources. Catherine Simard, who has done sort of the seminal research on underground connections in the forest, describes large trees as subsidizing small trees. So they're physically passing resources via these underground fungal networks to smaller trees. It's yet another reason to keep some big trees as part of our forest. And And so the last thing that we want to do is compromise the health of that amazing soil, which is also what we're going to use to grow future generations of trees. And so other stuff we can do, just putting dead wood on the ground, performs all these amazing functions, including as those rot, they're going to build soil, and also they're going to soak up water, which is going to prevent erosion, which is going to prevent soil from basically leaving the system and sort of lock that soil in place. Let's see what else we have here. Soils are really important. The other thing is we know that prior to European settlement, they had these really deep developed soils, which were largely developed by mixing. So as trees fell over, if you see a tree fall over in the woods, they have what's called a root ball. So they pull up their root system and it's sticking up in the air, and that actually mixes the lower layers of soil with the upper layers of soil, and it creates this really deep, rich soil profile. Let's see. Are there any areas from Logan? Thanks, Logan. Are there any areas of Vermont that would be considered model forest? State land, areas around the state that private landowners can visit to see a real example of forestry. I've been trying to do this on town forests, and I just completed a project, a 2-year project at the Heinsberg Town Forest, where we did management through logging, and we utilized these principles of ecological forest management, which are also used by consulting foresters. I didn't invent them. It's basically drawing on a body of research, sort of new, what are called new forestry, which of course is a term that was coined in 1989. But ecological forest management, is becoming more and more common practice. But what I did was basically go out of my way to really, really try and demonstrate that in a public way. And also, so it's ecological forest management, managing forests basically like they manage themselves, and then also trying to encourage forests to be more like old growth forests. So that's a sort of a emerging area of study, is how do we make our forests more like old growth forests. And so I did that on the Heinsberg Town Forest, did a bunch of educational stuff around that from the Economer Road access, and we're hoping to build in some long-lasting educational resources around that, so you can go and visit and see what this kind of forest management is like. Polly Darnell said, if you have any recently downed pines in your woodland, is there any advantage or disadvantage to cutting the branches to get them on the ground to rot there? And I would say that that you shouldn't do that. And the reason for that is because those trees, as they fall on the ground, are also producing all these amazing benefits. And it's not just from them rotting on the ground. We don't necessarily want them to even rot faster. As they're standing up, they're going to be grouse drumming logs, and they're going to be habitat for amphibians and microinvertebrates and fungi, and we want them to just sort of take their natural course and actually break down slowly. We understand that the structure, we call it structure, that's provided by just sort of a dead tree on the ground itself has value, and every part of that decomposition as it becomes soil also has value. And so we wouldn't want to rush out that process. The real reason why people normally do that is to make it look nicer. And I would challenge all of you as land managers and people who appreciate it to understand that, to sort of reframe your aesthetics of what you think a healthy forest looks like, or what a forest is supposed to look like, and be comfortable with it looking messy. And so I told loggers that I've done projects with, I've said, I want you specifically to not cut up the treetops and branches that are on the ground. I want you to leave them messy. And they didn't want to do it because they were afraid of people seeing their work and thinking that they did a poor job because it looks messy, and they've always thought that they're supposed to make it look nice. But hopefully we're starting to reframe that. Okay, so lastly, I want to give Ashley Parker from the city of South Burlington a chance to say something. South Burlington sponsored this webinar, and I think she wants to say a couple words. Ashley, you out there?
I am.
Hey, Ashley.
I'm sorry I missed the start of the webinar or this meeting, this virtual experience. I wanted to thank everybody for coming, because this has been a very interesting time, and Ethan was very gracious to put this hike. We were supposed to have a hike on Saturday, I think it was, at Red Rocks, and he was willing to put something online so we could still share information and knowledge with everybody about forests and ecology. So I just want to thank him for doing this in the evening, and I hope all of you found it to be beneficial. I also want to just say that we are hoping to do more online virtual experiences like this. The city is working to get some more things lined up. So please stay tuned. I've been trying to post on Front Porch Forum. I've been sharing Ethan's online experiences. So if you have any questions about what's coming or what you can do, feel free to email me at the city. I'm online checking mail, so I can probably help fill you in. But that's all I really wanted to say is just thank you. And also, if you guys have ever been to Red Rocks Park, we have a survey on our rec department website trying to get community input and feedback for a management plan revisions and updates that we've been working on. We're still trying to do that at this moment in time. So if you have anything you'd like to share with us, please take the survey and share your